The sky tore like old fabric and dropped Tim Red Walker onto a boulevard that smelled like promethium and fear. He hit hard, rolled, and came up with his bowstaff already in his hands because muscle memory doesn't wait for gravity to finish. Around him, towers rose like black ribs. Brass eagles watched with blind judgment from every cornice. Sirens layered with organ-deep alarms. Loudhailers recited prayers to drown out screaming. Red. Kara's voice came through the smoke, bright as a flare. She burst into view a heartbeat later. Kara Blaze, hair burning orange, boots hanging a foot off the ground, palms dripping starfire that painted the haze with moving gold. She scanned for him, found him, and the worry in her eyes flashed out as relief and then focus. "Are you intact?" "Working on it," he said, already mapping cover and angles. "Roll call." "Present," Ren Noctis answered from somewhere the light didn't want to go. Her silhouette flowed out of the smoke, cloak dragging shadow like it had weight. The air around her rippled in a way that made Tim's ears pop. Her voice was steady but too careful. "Something is wrong with the sky." "Ditto," Victor Vex Stone called, stepping over a splintered traffic barrier. Panels slid across his chest with a soft hydraulicum, locking into an armored plate. His right forearm unfolded to reveal the warm throat of a particle cannon. A servoskull drifted past him and froze, as if uncertain which god to salute. My arm just asked to recite a canticle. I am not emotionally prepared for that. A green wolf loped out of an alley with glass in its fur and annoyance in its eyes. The wolf became a lean boy mid-stride, then a tiger as his frustration met the riot of smells. Logan Green shook dust from his whiskers. Street tacos this is not. The city made an ugly kind of sense all at once, the way battlefields do. Ash-gray soldiers in long coats pulled civilians behind a wreck of sandbags. Zealots in lacquered crimson armor surged from a side street with symbols carved into their plates like fresh scars. Their leader carried a hammer that spat gnats of light. He intoned something in a voice that felt like someone dragging chain across Tim's teeth. "You don't need to know the language to know that's bad," Tim said. "Kara, take high. Vex, throttle the big hammer. Logan, left flank angry. Ren." "I know." She lifted 2 fingers and the smoke bent. A dozen cultists stumbled as if gravity had tripped them. "Keep them away from me and I'll keep that from becoming a mouth." She tipped her chin toward the sky. He forced himself to look. A wound had opened above the spires, a raw gash rimmed in orange lightning. The edges crawled like stitched flesh trying to remember how to be skin. Something inside that tear pressed against reality the way a cheek presses against a veil. No time to be afraid and still be useful. Tim sprinted, staff a metronome, and the team moved the way only a team does after 1,000 drills and 100 bad nights. Kara rose into the haze and cut a bright line through the zealots' advance, starbolts slamming into red plate and staggering them. Victor planted his feet, braced, and his cannon sang a harsh, pure note that drilled through a champion's chest and stitched light into the brick behind him. Logan's tiger hit a shield wall and turned it into a memory. The zealot preacher laughed and swung the hammer at Tim. The head left a smear of afterglow in the air. Tim slid inside the arc, planted the end of his staff on a kneecap seam, and let physics do the sermon. The man dropped with a grunt and no more laughter. A las pistol tracked Tim from a barricade. Its owner, cheek smeared with soot, peaked cap half melted, had the look of someone who had been awake long enough to forget the shape of sleep. She had sergeant's tabs and a voice that could cut metal. "Identify yourselves or get sanctified." "On your side," Tim said, because that was faster than an essay on dimensional accidents. "Call me Red. Evac your people down that street. We'll fold their line." She did not lower the pistol. She stepped out, scanned the team with eyes that made fast decisions. "3rd Vesperin, Sergeant Mara Keen. If you're lying, I will shoot you while saying a prayer and mean both." Then she spun on her soldiers. "Push from the left. Keep civilians between you and the red freaks never. Move." Ren drifted to the middle of the street and raised both hands. Her fingers trembled. Tim had seen her stand in the center of hurricanes without blinking, and today she looked like someone holding a door shut against a house full of wolves. Above, The tear in the sky flexed wide enough for the city to inhale in fear. "Stay out," she whispered to whatever lived on the other side. "You aren't invited." The preacher on the plinth began again, louder, bleeding syllables that crawled like ants. The wound bulged in answer. Windows cracked across 3 blocks with a sound like ice breaking. Tim vaulted onto the statue base 2 steps at a time. The preacher swung. Tim parried. Sparks spun off and died before they could remember they'd been light. He jabbed for a throat seam and hit a collar, then pivoted, drove the staff's butt plate into the man's ribs. Breath left the zealot in a wet grunt. Tim didn't kill him. He broke his rhythm until the sermon stumbled and fell. "Knee!" Keen barked, and a guardsman slid under a lost bolt that would have taken him in the face. Kara snapped a starbolt across a rooftop and vaporized a cultist trying to flank the barricade with a stubber. Victor walked his beam across a heavy red pauldron and kept going until he found something the armor couldn't lie for any longer. Logan, now a bear because sometimes a bear is the correct number of teeth, waded through a knot of zealots and sent them flying, a low growl like a truck grinding gears ratcheting out of his chest. The sky pushed. Wind blew inward from every street like breath being held. Tim felt words he didn't understand try to write themselves into the soft parts behind his eyes. Wren's jaw clenched until a line of blood showed where she bit her lip. "Wren," he called, not loud, not soft. "Keep it simple, keep it human. With me." "Can't spare a hand," she said, voice thin as thread. "Give me 90 seconds. "Copy." He moved to give her 90 violent seconds. The crimson line broke the way all lines do when you make their math bad. Kara drove zealots back from the barricade. Keen's squad pulled a dozen civilians through the gap and down into a service tunnel. Victor, muttering to a machine in language that should have been ridiculous and somehow wasn't, coaxed a wrecked transport to roll itself just enough to form a wall. Logan bayed as a wolf to scatter a clutch of cultists who were too brave and not smart, then became a hawk and took the alley's height like it owed him money. A new chant snapped across the plaza and cut under everything else. It wasn't louder. It was closer to whatever the world uses for bone. The zealot preacher wasn't preaching anymore. Someone behind him was. A tall figure in crimson plate stepped onto the plinth. Helmet worked into horns, Crozius in his fist slick with light that puddled wrong on the stone. "Don't like that," Victor said flatly. "Neither do they," Keen muttered, and Tim knew she meant her gods and her nightmares in the same breath. The horned figure raised his weapon. Words rose out of him like smoke from a bad fire. The wound in the sky swelled until the hair on Tim's arms stood up as if the whole city were a cat bristling. Wren staggered. The tear tried to become a mouth. Kara streaked high and slammed a 2-handed bolt of sun into the horned man's chest. It didn't knock him down, but it stuttered the syllables. Tim used that heartbeat to cross the last meters, spring from a knee, and drive the staff, collapsed, then snapping long, into the center of the crimson Aquila on the man's chest. The plate dented. The chant choked. Tim landed, spun, took a gauntlet across the shoulder that would have torn the arm off someone built to normal specifications, and didn't stay where the second swing expected him to be. Down the street, a child sobbed the way only children can sob when they have run out of breath and fear and are working with the last of both. Logan twisted mid-air and took a chain axe bite on Rhino hide, momentum smashing the axeman into a wall so hard the graffiti tried to flee. He shrank back to himself with a gasp, one hand feeling dumbly at the groove cut across his back. It sealed with a shiver. He smiled a not-ready smile. "Still 1 star, he managed. "Would not recommend." "Hold that line." Keen roared, and her troopers did, faith and stubbornness making a bridge over a gap where common sense would have fallen. The horned zealot drew breath for another verse. Wren whispered a word that the air didn't like and the verse stuck in his throat like a bad swallow. Tim took the opportunity to remind the man that knees bend both ways if you invite them. The Crozius clanged off the plinth. The horned helm hit stone a second later. The mouth above them cinched a fraction. "Status," Tim called, eyes up where Wren's fight was happening. "Temporary," she said. Sweat traced a clean line through ash on her cheek. "It wants to be here. That's its entire personality." "Relatable," Logan murmured, already sniffing for the next bad decision approaching at speed. Engines howled like pipe organs losing a bet. The sound rolled down the avenues, bounced off the spire, and came back with teeth. Keen's head snapped up. Victor's cannon whined into a higher key. Kara rose and set her shoulders. Shapes punched out of the smoke and came down in kneeling thunder. Blue and white giants in armor crowded with wax-sealed prayers. Jump packs blasted heat across the plaza and burned devotional sigils into the grit. Helmets like grim statuary turned toward the barricade, toward the titans, toward the horned corpse, toward the still trembling seam in the sky. The lead giant rose, sword across his breastplate, as if space itself made room for his voice. By writ of the holy ordos, the vox made him say like a chorus through a cathedral, "Kneel." Ren flinched. "If I kneel," she said almost to herself, "I drop the lid." Tim's grip tightened on the staff. Keen stood between her troopers and the giants like a line drawn in pencil in front of a storm. Kara hovered eye level with the lead giant, hands at her sides, palms still bright. Victor shifted half an inch so his cannon was not pointed at anyone and not pointing away either. Logan licked blood from his lip and smiled like a man who remembered jokes exist and liked them anyway. The engines snuffed out. The smoke settled. Somewhere in the basement of the world, a bell began to toll. Tim met the giant's black visor and said, without making it an argument, "We're holding your sky together. Can we do introductions after that?" The giant's visor didn't blink, but something in the way he held the sword tilted, as if he heard the sense in it. The jump packs still seethed heat across the paving. Ren's hands didn't lower. The seam in the sky flexed like a muscle holding a door against a storm. Another figure walked out of the smoke as if it had been waiting for him to arrive before it let itself thin. Black robes, neat gloves, a symbol at his throat that made soldiers straighten without meaning to. The man's eyes were scholar-tired and precise. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. "Sergeant Cashin," he said to the lead giant, "stand easy." The Marine obeyed by degrees that would have looked like stillness on anyone smaller. Tim barely let himself exhale. The robed man turned to Ren, not at her power but at her posture, at the way she pressed her palms toward the air like she was smoothing down the hackles of a living thing. "You are holding it," he said. "For the next 30 seconds, Ren answered through clenched teeth. "After that, it holds us." He produced from his sleeve a brass device like a snowflake with too many points. It unfolded with a click that felt like a key turning somewhere that had never had a lock. The air rang. The seam pinched smaller, not closed, but less hungry. "Interrogator Arcturus Vane, Ordo Xenos," he said, almost as an afterthought, then glanced at the horned corpse on the plinth. And this would be a sermon interrupted. "Useful." "Red," Tim offered, because names are levers and he needed everyone. He nodded toward Keen without taking his eyes from Vane. "Third Vesperin is moving civilians to safety. We can keep moving your sky the right direction if we do it together." Vane studied the team the way a craftsman studies a tool he didn't expect to find on his bench. The rosette at his throat caught a guttering flame and flared. "You saved lives," he said at last. "Here, that buys conversation. It does not buy trust." "I'm rich in conversation," Tim said. He kept his tone light and his stance easy and did not relax anything that would get someone killed. "What do you need and where do you need it?" "An anchor point beneath the spire," Vane replied, already folding the brass sigil shut. "Break it and the wound in the sky stops answering sermons like a dog to a whistle. Sergeant Keen, continue evacuation to the Basilica sublevels. Sergeant Cashin, your squad with me to the spire. The assets," he added as if testing the word on his tongue, "will accompany under watch." Cashin's helm turned, that tiny tilt again as if to say the world had surprised him and he didn't mind. "Acknowledged," he intoned, and the jump pack's exhaust faded into the case-hard silence of men who had seen worse and would likely see it again at noon. Ren took a shaking breath and eased her palms down until they were just hands again instead of a lid on a jar. The seam in the sky didn't like it. The brass device hummed once and the dislike settled into a sulk. Keen holstered her pistol and spoke into her vox, voice clipped and steady. "Basilica route is green. Vesperin 3, move your feet like they pay you per step." She turned to Tim as if she'd decided to gamble and couldn't stand to be coy about it. If you make a mess of this, I am going to pretend I never met you and shoot whoever's left. Understood, Tim said. Let's try the option where nobody has to pretend. They moved through streets that had been designed to make a person feel small. Shrines rattled with train schedules and prayers. Banners of flayed text twisted in the wind. Keen's troopers pivoted and peeled like they had drilled it in every weather. The armored angels walked in their wake like statues that had misremembered how to be still. Vane threaded the group like a metronome, breath even, eyes everywhere. At a shaft door trimmed with cog-toothed saints, a cogskull descended and sang denial in binary. A chorus of pistons somewhere behind the door hissed holy refusal. A machine spirit, Tim thought, was a bureaucracy with voltage. A shape scuttled into view on metal legs. Robes whispered, lenses blinked in red, then green, then a color Tim didn't have a word for. The newcomer's voice clattered like gears that had learned to enjoy themselves. Unregistered archaeotech interface organism, the tech priest declared, peering directly at Victor's arm. Self-willed. Conversational. Delightful. I'm Victor, Victor said, keeping his cannon pointed at the floor because nobody needed an accident here. Friends call me Vex. We can swap serial numbers later. Names are inefficient, the machine priest, Muggos Lexum, he volunteered without saying the word, said with academic delight. But I concede their utility. He turned to the cogskull. You will permit transit. It offends me when doors forget what they are for. The skull chirped a different hymn. Locks thunked. The shaft doors parted to reveal an elevator cage shaped like a chapel. Pews bolted to the walls, little shelves of candle stubs at knee level. Keen's people eyed the cage like it had a temper. The Marines didn't glance at it at all. They were built to go through things that didn't want them to. Lexum, Vane said quietly, as if they were old colleagues who had taken different vows. After the city stops breathing smoke, you may write me a monograph about what you think Victor is. In this moment, we have an anchor to pry up. Lexum's lenses slid toward Tim's team, curious and positively radiant with the prospect of questions. I will expect an interview, he told Victor, and if his tone had a smile in it, it was a mechanical one. The skull chittered again. The cage lurched. The elevator climbed through a throat of stone. Service alcoves flickered past, each with a little devotional plaque. Do not spit, do not fear, do not touch the sanctified wiring. Voices bled in from landings as they rose, children chittering through fear to make a game of it. Someone praying under their breath like they were slinging a rope hand over hand in the dark. A guardsman telling a joke so bad it had to be a charm. Wren closed her eyes and didn't. Kara hovered an inch off the floor because some part of her always did when she was thinking about not touching anything fragile. The cage shuddered to a stop at a hab level where the doors had jammed half open on a buckled frame. The air that came in tasted like tin and hot dust. Somewhere down that corridor, people were screaming in a way that meant the screams hadn't convinced anyone to stop hurting them yet. Keen's jaw ticked. That's a stack. We don't have time. Tim had already looked past her shoulder and seen the map the corridor made in his head. A stairwell at the far end. A laundry shaft that could be a vertical artery. A balcony overlooking a square with good sightlines and terrible cover. The wail of an infant harmonizing with the drumbeat rhythm of boots hitting metal in the next hall. We make time, Tim said. He didn't look at Vane when he said it. He didn't have to. If Vane said no, the answer could do what it wanted somewhere that wasn't here. Kara, lift the heat. Don't cook them. Just make it hard to breathe in the wrong rooms. Vex, cut me clean doors with no shrapnel. Logan, go hawk. Find vents and anything this corridor is pretending not to have. Wren, keep them calm without walking into anyone's head. Keen, I'll keep my people from shooting at you while you do miracles, she said, dry as bone. Move. They moved. Kara's palms glowed dull orange and the air shifted. A thermal current that rode under the screams and boomed through open mouths until zealots coughed and stumbled and raised weapons with eyes watering. Victor sank a cutting beam into a hinge and winked the door off its frame like he'd unscrewed a jar lid. Logan winged down a vent and came out over a landing full of red armor, then became a boulder with claws and a bad mood directly on their heads. Wren paced the corridor like a tuning fork. People around her stopped making keening sounds without quite knowing why. Tim slipped through the holes his team made with a staff and a list of joints that didn't like being reminded they were joints. He took a man off his feet without taking him off the payroll of being alive. He made the habit of stepping between a rifle and a person it had no business pointing at. He wished he had 1 hour to rest the way you wish for oceans in a desert. They cleared a landing and then the next and then a room that had been a chapel before someone had dragged the pews into a barricade. Mothers hustled toddlers over splinters. An old man in an apron cradled a kettle like it was a relic. A boy whose face had never learned to shave yet held a lost pistol and shook hard enough to make it dance. Keen slid it from his hand and put a canteen into it instead. He drank like he'd been forgiven something. From the stairwell below, a chainsaw voice filled the air with teeth. Logan looked at Tim, then down the well. Tim nodded once. The tiger that launched himself into the stairwell was all the answer the sound deserved. Metal screamed. Someone else did. Logan came back up as a hawk, blood trailing off his wingtips like pinstriping, and settled onto the banister with a rattle of talons that said he was fine and fight drunk and would feel all of this later when nobody was watching. They exfiltrated people into the elevator cage until the chapel was lighter by 20 heartbeats. The cage would make 2 trips whether it liked it or not. Vane said nothing, which was how Tim knew the man was paying the cost out of a ledger he kept under his ribs. On the 3rd landing, a zealot with a grenade tried to solve everyone's afternoon. Victor flicked a panel out of his own arm, palms up as if placating a skittish animal. The grenade beeped and went quiet in the zealot's hand, then clattered to the floor like it had remembered it was just a lump of iron that someone had lied to. The zealot looked at it, then at Victor, then at his hands as if deciding which betrayal to hate. He ran. Keen let him. You don't always have to win every argument on the first try. When the elevator returned, the jump pack angels were aboard, 6 blue statues making the space feel smaller by existing inside it. Cashin stepped out to cover the corridor without being asked, his shadow filling half the wall. A child reached a finger toward the purity seals hanging from his pauldron, then thought better. Cashin shifted a fraction to give the mother room to pass. It felt like a concession the size of a city block. On the way back up, Vane peeled Ren into a side alcove that still had a broken saint watching from a niche. He spoke softly enough that the others could pretend not to hear. If you slip, he said, I will end you faster than prayer. If I slip, Ren said, and met his gaze with eyes that had too much old in them for someone her age. I expect you to. He held her eyes a beat longer than protocol would suggest, then reached into his robe and produced a locket the size of a thumbnail, etched with sigils that made the air disapprove. He laid it in her palm. It felt like a freezer door. She put it on and swallowed like she'd just drunk a cup of winter. The elevator spat them onto a promenade that had once been beautiful and now looked like a mouth missing teeth. The spire rose ahead, close enough to make you wish for distance. Between here and there, the city made one more demand, a plaza strung with prayer flags and clogged with overturned market stalls. Smoke pooled in the arcades like water in a basin. Somewhere in that smoke, someone chanted in the wrong direction, syllables hopping from stone to stone like sparks looking for dry grass. Keen checked the charge on her pistol and rolled the stiffness out of her neck. You'll want to see this, she said, and then the smoke opened like a curtain letting through a scene nobody had rehearsed. The smoke thinned to show a market that had tried very hard to be holy and then failed at being safe. Prayer flags snapped from lines strung between colonnades. Fruit stalls lay on their sides with oranges crushed into sunset pulp. In the open square, a half-circle of civilians knelt with hands on their heads, backed by a wall of crimson armor. The zealots had dragged a pulpit from somewhere and hammered it into the flagstones. A vox horn mounted to it hissed like a snake learning to sing. At its base, a child clutched a wooden toy saint with both hands and refused to cry any softer. Tim didn't give orders right away. He looked, counted, let the awful geometry of it settle. 2 heavy gunners behind a saint's statue, fields of fire crossing the plaza. A chant team to the right, harmonics braided to worry the wound in the sky. On the left, 6 zealots holding a line of hostages like a shield that breathed. In the center, a champion in hornless crimson plate. No sermon, just a posture that said he enjoyed what happened to a place when his boots stood on it. Vane's voice touched his ear as if it were a hand not asking to be taken. "We cannot risk a mass push. Collateral will be unforgivable." "We won't," Tim said. He pointed, quick and small, so the gestures didn't have to travel far. "Kara, take the roofline gunners. Blind them, don't cook the statues. Vex, wake anything here with a machine spirit and make it remember which way is home. Logan, we need the left flank empty without making the hostages explode from adrenaline. Ren, I'll make their hearts remember walking," she said, already stepping forward with palms open. Cashin heard the plan and didn't object. That was as good as agreement from a man who made agreements by cutting them into the world. Keen licked ash from her lip, checked the charge on her pistol, and drifted left with 2 troopers to be where panic would try to corner itself. Kara rose, just enough to get a view, and sent thin fingers of orange flare up the columns, heat mirages curling off stone. The gunners blinked at a world that suddenly had more air than eyes. Their barrels stuttered off target. Victor crouched at a toppled vendor's cart, ripped the belly out of a burnt servitor with one practiced twist, and wired it into the back of a devotional loudspeaker with a tenderness that would have looked like heresy if it weren't so obviously love. The speaker coughed, rejected the cultist feed, and began to recite a train schedule and a safety warning in a gentle contralto. It would have been funny if it hadn't been a wedge that slid the chant team's rhythm to pieces. Logan loped low along the square's edge as a fox, for the color of old copper and shadows, then swelled into a hound and then into a man again just long enough to throw a wink at a woman who had run out of courage 10 minutes ago and somehow found a little more because of it. He became a tiger at the last step because sometimes theater is a tactic. The zealot holding the nearest hostage turned to shoot at the animal his brain told him was the bigger story. Logan knocked the rifle away with one paw, took the man's knees with the other, and was gone as a hawk before bullets remembered to arrive. Ren walked into the open and did the thing Vane didn't like her doing and Tim needed her to do. Not mind control. She hated the idea as much as anyone with a conscience and a spine, but the softest version of leadership there is. She set her breath where the kneeling civilians could hear it. She made her steps a count they could borrow. She said without speaking, "When I stand, you stand. When I walk, you walk. When I say left, we are a river." Hands lowered a fraction. Shoulders dropped. The first hostage rose like a puppet until you noticed he was choosing to. "Now," Tim said, and the team's timing condensed into a single action stretched across 5 bodies. He moved first, because you should never ask someone to stand up into fire without showing them how. The staff took the champion's first swing off the center line. A second later the weapons half-hit stone with a crack that argued with the plaza about what it wanted to be. Kara snapped a bright ribbon of heat across the heavy gunner's belts, buckles popping open like surprised mouths. Victor's hijacked loudspeaker doubled its volume and recited, in that calm voice, instructions for orderly egress that Ren's river of people followed as if the city itself had remembered how to shepherd. Logan dove through a zealot's legs as a wolf and came up as a man with his palms on the rifle, wrenching it out of hands that had planned to die gripping it. The champion in crimson plate laughed. It wasn't theatrical. It was just a man who had always gotten away with this kind of afternoon. He palmed Tim's staff aside and drove a gauntlet into Tim's chest hard enough to make a fireworks show inside his ribs. Tim went back 2 steps, rolled the hurt into a pivot, and didn't think about what everything would feel like later. Cashin chose that moment to arrive with the inevitability of falling stone. His jump pack struck air. His sword took the champion's attention because there is a kind of blade that ends all other opinions. Sparks carved their own small daylight through smoke. Purity seals flapped like shredded confetti around a mausoleum at a parade. Left clear. Keen barked, because the hostages on that side had gotten to their feet in a wave and her troopers had made a corridor with their bodies. Move, move, keep low, kiss the floor later, move. The chant team tried to gather itself. Ren drew a small circle in the air with her forefinger and the sound stumbled as if the syllables had tripped. One of the chanters, suddenly just a man who missed his mother, coughed himself breathless and fell down crying. Another kept going, eyes rolling back, mind wrapped in a net of faith that had teeth in it. Ren grimaced and held the net not to stop him but to keep it from dragging anyone else along. The champion fainted high and kicked Tim's knee with a crunch that would have folded someone who wasn't ready to be hurt. Tim let the leg go the wrong way a little and then came back around on the same foot, using the momentum to drive his staff into the side seam under the other man's arm. He felt something give. The champion stopped laughing. A zealot with a chain axe roared and ran, neon teeth sputtering, mouth open to make room for more roar. The path that would make sense took him straight through a child who had not moved fast enough. Logan collided with him first at elephant size, the kind with ears like altar cloths, turning the momentum sideways and into a stall of bruised pears. The axe bit deep across gray hide and parted it like a curtain until green skin knit behind the bite half a second later. Logan bellowed because pain is still pain, and then he was a bear and the zealot went skidding backward as if he'd tried to tackle a house. Rhino versus chainsaw, Logan panted, later, always with a joke when the air let him steal one. 1 star. Would not recommend. Cashin's blade took the champion in the chest and pinned him to a prayer carved into the plinth. The man tried to spit a benediction, but it came out a cough. Cashin pressed. The prayer now read differently. The square pivoted from murder to logistics. Civilians poured through the corridor Keen's people held. Victor kept the tram schedule talking because a gentle voice telling you to walk left and keep your loved ones close is sometimes all a city needs to remember how to come apart in the correct direction. Kara landed in front of the last cluster of hostages and made herself a wall of warmth, a windbreak against flying panic. The child with the wooden saint stared up at her as if he had been waiting his whole life for a picture that made this much sense. He fumbled something from his pocket, one of those tiny paper cards soldiers pin under their coats, a saint's face half rubbed away by rough cloth and bad days. He stared at the image, then at Kara's hair, then at the image again. His hands trembled until the saint looked a little more like her. He tucked it back into his shirt like a promise he'd written down to remind himself he'd made it. Wren leaned on a market table, sweat making black commas through ash on her face. Vane stepped into her shadow. He didn't offer the locket. It was already around her neck, cold as a warning. He did not say good work. He said acceptable, because he was trying to be the man his job required and it didn't make him any less useful. Your acceptable buys us 2 blocks, Keen told him without looking up from her people. Maybe 3 if the saints are bored. 2 will do, Vane said. He glanced at the spire, as if calculating how many minutes high stone and heavy air could hold against a world that had learned new ways to break. Assets with me. Tim looked across the plaza. The Marines were reforming with a neatness that would have embarrassed geometry. Cashin peeled his sword out of the plinth and shook gore from a scripture that wanted to cling. He nodded to Tim, acknowledgement, not friendship. Good enough. They moved again, through arcades that smelled like spice ground into old wood and fear burned into stone. At a fountain turned into a field hospital, a sister in white linen tied Kara's singed gauntlet with a touch that made her close her eyes the way a person does when kindness sneaks up on them. A guardsman made room for Logan on a step just by scooting an inch and pretending he hadn't. Logan pretended not to notice and sat anyway. Victor paused at a stack of generator crates and listened, head cocked, until one of them coughed in binary. He rapped it just so and the coughing settled into a purr. He smiled like a mechanic hearing an old friend forgive him. They cut through an engine chapel where flensed machine parts hung like organs and votive candles guttered around a bolt the size of a child. The air tasted like oil, cool and sweet. Victor's eyes went soft and distant. They're whispering a map, he said. Let them, Lexam murmured, suddenly there at his elbow like a polite imp. And then write it down. The city's throat narrowed into a staircase that ran along the skin of the spire, each step stamped with a warning and a blessing. Above, the wound in the sky sulked, smaller for now, resentful about it. Wind worried prayer flags into snapping. The team climbed because there was nowhere else to go that didn't count as losing. On the 3rd landing, Vane raised a fist and the column stopped the way water stills when the wind stops. He tilted his head. His vox bead scratched once. Cashin's hand went to his bolter with the ease of a habit older than his fear. Problem? Tim asked, already making a shape with his free hand that meant the team should loosen, not lock. An overzealous message from a subordinate, Vane said, voice flat, eyes sharper than knives. Misinformation tends to breed shooting. I'm handling it. Tim caught the aftertaste of the words. A kill order rushed up the chain by someone too scared to distinguish strangers from threats. He watched Cashin not move and understood something about the man he'd be trusting his life to at the top of the stairs. They climbed the rest of the way with their breath loud enough to pass for a prayer. The spire's doors loomed, worked in iron and covered in reliefs of battles that had probably looked better in the telling. The metal was warm, like a thing that remembered fire. Tim felt the team array around him, not in ranks but in the pattern of hands reaching for one another without thinking. Ren touched the locket and winced. Kara flexed her fingers and drew in a breath that was more sun than air. Victor rolled a shoulder where plates had settled wrong and then right. Logan grinned at nothing in particular. They pushed the doors and stepped into a nave that had been remade not for worship but for machinery and a purpose called down from a throat in the sky. The sound of chanting came from somewhere below, stitched up through grates in the floor, a baseline for the day's better intentions. Vane's jaw tightened. Cashin's bolter lifted. Anchors beneath, Victor said, eyes unfocused, listening to whatever in the walls had decided he counted as family. It's big, and it's eating the building to pay for its appetite. Then we take its fork, Tim said, because jokes keep your hands working. He looked at his team, at the angels, at the man in black silk and steel who held mercy like something he might break by mistake. Same rule as the street. We do the right thing the right way. They moved toward the stairs down, each step loud enough to call the next fight up to meet them, and none of them slowed. The stairs tightened until they felt more like a throat than a passage. Iron ribs arched overhead, every beam etched with prayers that had been polished by generations of hands. The air grew warmer the lower they went, a kiln's breath, and under it all a vibration like a cathedral-sized heart ticking just a little too fast. Somewhere below, chanting climbed and fell in tides. There was rhythm to it, the kind you could walk to if you weren't careful. Feel that. Victor murmured, palm against the wall. Plates along his forearm slid, exposing braided cable and a small, flickering icon that looked almost shy. They've wired devotion into the building. It's not elegant, but it's stubborn. Like us, Logan said, because he couldn't leave a straight line uncurved, and because humor is the rope you toss your friends when the floor wants to be water. Ren's steps never faltered, but Tim saw the tightness at the corners of her mouth. The Sinol locket lay against her throat like a coin of winter. The wound in the sky felt farther and closer at once, a pressure in the teeth. She breathed in time with her steps and watched the rhythm below like you watch a dog that hasn't decided whether you're food or family. They hit a landing where the stairs opened into a maintenance platform. 2 servoskulls in brass cages bobbed there, incense sticks anchored to their housings and lit. The smoke tasted like copper and regret. A lattice of red light flickered across the corridor beyond, thin as hair but plenty real. Cashin lifted a hand and his squad stopped with the precision of a mechanical watch. Trip lattice tied to sanctified countermeasures, Vane said without touching anything, which Tim appreciated. Break it and we learn new meanings of the word trap. Or, Victor said, kneeling by a wall panel whose screws had been devoutly sealed in wax, we ask politely. He peeled the wax without breaking the stamped prayers. Careful, almost reverent. Muggos Lexum's lenses clicked as if he were trying to clap without hands. Victor slid the panel aside, exposing a shrine of wires, a little candle shelf, a tiny metal Aquila glued to a bundle of optic lines, a stamped tin face that had once been a saint and was now a heat sink. He placed 2 fingers on the frame and spoke low, a syncopated mutter that wasn't quite binary, wasn't quite human. It sounded like a lullaby written by an engine. The servoskulls rotated toward him, sensors glowing, smoke feathers drifting. For a second Tim had the insane impression that they were listening. The red lattice dimmed 1 lumen. Then another. The beams thinned until they were only a suggestion. Liturgical handshake. Lexum breathed, delighted. Improvised. Improper. Inspired. Second chances, Victor said, as if that explained everything. Let us through and I'll owe you a song. They passed the gate without it deciding to become a lesson. The corridor beyond sloped down, stone giving way to armored decking. Icons here were cut deeper, edges sharper, the prayer text smaller and more numerous until the walls looked like pages from a book hammered open. The chanting below thickened, no longer just sound but a pressure front. Tim could feel the way the words leaned on the world. A gust of sweet air rolled up at them. Not clean, exactly, but kinder. Kara narrowed her eyes. "There's heat pooling," she said, making tiny adjustments with her palms until warmth slipstreamed past them, dragging threads of smoke to the ceiling. Someone's vented incense for psychers. "Filters," Vane ordered. Keen's troopers snapped hoods over their noses with practiced ugly grace. Vane offered Wren a mask. She shook her head. "It won't help," she said softly. "I'll keep it from being more than what it is." The locket glittered frost pale, and the cold in it made her breath steam in air that had no business being that hot. They hit the first opposition at the bottom of the next ramp. 2 turret servitors fused to plinths, faces erased into smooth plates, multi-lasers spitting neat, angry threads. Cashin stepped into the open as if he were built to deny geometry. Bolter booming, the report like a judge's gavel. Stone ricocheted. Keen's people hugged the wall and traded fire with the unhappy patience of professionals. Tim saw Kara weigh a straight-line dash and discard it because sometimes bravery is just another way to make your team pay your bill. "Give me 3 seconds, Victor said, already leaning into the wall again. "Then act like you meant to all along." He hissed something between a prayer and a whistle into the panel. The servitors' fire staggered, stuttered. For a heartbeat, the multi-lasers traced lines just wide of the corridor, blistering heat across the stone. Kara moved inside the mistake, a streak of orange. Her hands pressed to the plinths. The barrels puckered and slumped like wax kissed by a candle. The guns tried to weep and remembered they were metal. They drooped into uselessness. "Debt paid," Victor told the wall. He patted the frame with 2 knuckles. "You'll sing better in tune if you stop humming through that cracked bus. I'll fix it on the way out if we're not dead." "See that you're not," Vane said. There wasn't a smile in it, but there might have been a human. Beyond the turrets, the corridor forked. The left path led into a gallery where stained glass saints had been replaced by schematic diagrams and theorems written in devotional script. The right plunged deeper into a heat that felt like breath from a furnace door. Lexham craned toward the left so obviously that it counted as a kind of plea. "Later," Tim told him. "Gentle like you talk to someone who'll walk into traffic if they think the road is a footnote. If we leave the anchor running, there won't be windows to stare at." They took the right-hand path. The floor turned into a grate. Light flickered underfoot, sickly and pulsing. Logan dropped to a crouch and became a rat without ceremony. Green for a small laugh in a place that had forgotten laughter. He vanished between the bars, claws ticking, tail a whisper. Tim waited because sending is only half of trust. Waiting is the other. Logan returned in the form of a hawk that exploded out of a side vent with a rush of wings. He slid back to himself in one breath. "Anchors ahead," he said, voice pitched low. "Huge. Nails the size of flagpoles hammered into the bedrock. They're feeding it with words." He grimaced. "And batteries made of people." Keen swore once, a soldier's curse that had room in it for prayer. Cashin's jaw flexed behind his helm in a way that made no sound and felt like a decision. "How many?" Tim asked. "Score of chanters," Logan said. "Acolytes with knives that don't look like they kill bodies first. 2 bigger ones with armor like the champion, but..." He searched for the right insult. "Smugger." "Malak Kar?" Vane asked, tone clipped. "Didn't see the sermonizer-in-chief," Logan said. "But something in there smiled when I looked at it. Didn't have a face." Wren's eyes were on the floor, not in fear but because she was listening for seams. "If we break the rhythm, the anchor stumbles," she said. "If we break the nails, it falls. If we try to do both and we fail at either, the thing on the other side gets a hand in. I vote we pick one to start." "We start by not dying," Tim said, "because strategy only matters if you get to use the next page." He traced the air with the staff's tip, sketching a map none of them needed to see to understand. 4 points. Kara, overload their sigil lines. Short them into light instead of fuel. Vex, turn their relics into bad conductors. Give the nails a different job. Logan, control flow, no clumps, no stampedes. Get the civilians out of any pattern that makes them a battery. Wren looked up. "I will keep their choir from learning new verses," she said. I won't push. I won't touch. I'll just rest a hand on the book so it doesn't turn its own pages. Cashin and I will take the big uglies and keep them very, very interested, Tim finished. He didn't look at Vane when he added, Interrogator, if you have another of those brassy snowflakes that convince air to behave, this would be the time. Vane's mouth thinned. He produced a device like the first, lines etched deeper, edges darker, the kind of tool you only use when you agree with yourself later in writing. This will dampen a radius, he said. It will make singing harder and knives smarter. Keep your fingers. Kara flexed her hands. Light gathered along her fingers like a promise. Victor rolled his shoulder. Plates settled. Logan cracked his neck and smiled the kind of smile that gets better results than it deserves. Wren closed her eyes and let the locket cool her spine. Keen checked her people and found too many present to do anything but use them well. They moved. The anchor chamber's doors were iron, worked with reliefs that made war look like a procession. They stood half open, heat breathing through the gap, light pulsing the way a wound pulses when your heart forgets how fast to beat. The smell inside was not blood and not incense. It was something that wanted very badly to be both. Cashin took point. His boot pushed the door wide. The chant swelled in a tide that tried to lift the hair on Tim's arms. Rows of kneeling figures swayed, voices braided into a rope thrown up to the wound far above. Runes burned along the floor in loops and bars, flowing toward the center where the nails stood, black and vast, hammered into stone that looked like it had screamed once and found it inefficient. On a dais to the right, two armored figures turned. Their armor drank the light and sweated it back out as something meaner. They wore helms carved to look like skulls that laughed. Between them stood a man in robes the color of clotted wine, his face hidden by a hood trimmed in flayed scripture. He did not seem to be chanting, and yet the room sang around his silence as if it were the note all the other notes orbited. Good afternoon, Tim said, because sometimes you trip the board on purpose. He lifted the staff and felt the weight of every decision he'd made since the Sky Tour drop into his hands. We're here to shut down your generator. The hooded man turned his head. The room leaned with him. Wren's breath hitched once. Vane's device clicked open in his palm and the air shivered in a way that made the chanting flinch. The man pushed his hood back. His face was a sermon carved into scar and scar into sermon, every line a word he had forced into his own skin. When he smiled, it was with someone else's teeth. Children, he said, and the word came from the room, from the nails, from the place the wound wanted to be. You brought angels. How polite. Shall we see whose God arrives hungrier? Kara's hands lit like dawn. Victor's cannon charged with a rising hymn that shook dust from the rafters. Logan became a wolf without a sound. Wren stepped forward and lifted her palms, and the chant shuddered as if it had remembered, for a fraction of a second, that quiet exists. Cashin's jump pack screamed and he launched like a thrown oath. Tim moved on the same beat, staff cutting lines nobody else could see but everyone could use. They crossed the threshold together, and the room tried to teach them what it thought must happen next. They answered in their own grammar. For a breath, the room tried to convince them it was inevitable. The chant swelled and made the light tilt. The heat pressed hands to cheeks. Then Tim cut across the grain and the world had to make room. Cashin hit the nearer skull-helmed brute like a law landing. Sparks broke and fell in a bright rain. Tim slid past the other's opening swing, staff kissing the haft of a chain axe to spoil its arc, then snapped the buttplate into a hip seam. Armor rang like a bell with a crack in it. Now, he said, and the team scattered to their marks as if the word had always been waiting in their throats. Kara lifted both hands and the sigil lines answered like harp strings plucked too hard. She didn't fire straight. The runes wanted straight. She rolled starfire into pulses, not beams, offbeat to the chant, and fed the floor a rhythm it couldn't swallow. Light bled along the loops and then shorted sideways, dazzling instead of feeding. One ring sputtered and went dark, its vapors turning into harmless heat that made the air shimmer. Victor dropped to a knee at the nearest relic pillar, pried open a prayer-sealed panel, and found a bouquet of wires braided with ribbon and wax. I see you, he murmured, fingers hovering. Let's give you a better job. His forearm split. A wafer-thin interface unfurled like the petal of a steel flower. He hummed the liturgical handshake he'd improvised upstairs, changed 3 notes, and watched a set of status lights shift from hungry red to stubborn amber. "Hold," he told the pillar. "Hold, not rend." The pillar's hum deepened, as if relieved to have a verb it preferred. Logan flowed through the bodies like a rumor. Fox, boy, hawk, boy, wolf, boy. His hands freed bonds without yanking. His jokes misfired on purpose so people could groan and breathe at the same time. Left, left, your other left. Perfect, that's military left. He grew to a bear to take a wild swing meant for a kneeling woman and shrank to a rat to slip under a rope and chew it through. "Breathe on my count," he told the line as he moved with them. "In 2, 3. Out 2, 3. You're a river. Rivers don't panic." Wren stepped into the first edge of the choir's sound and touched it without taking it. She set her breath to the tempo and then moved 1 beat aside. The chant stumbled, tried to follow, and found itself half a pace off. She did it again, smaller, and the syllables tripped. An acolyte sang on, eyes rolling back, entranced by the wrong thing. She put a hand near his cheek without touching, and he startled awake into weeping and ran. She didn't chase. She just kept the book from turning its page. The hooded man watched with the patient interest of a butcher before the market opens. Vane's device clicked open in his palm with the sound of a lock remembering it's supposed to close. The air grew heavier and cleaner at once. The chant lost top end. Knives gleamed a little meaner. "Stay off the edges," Vane warned, voice clipped. "It narrows talent in both directions." Cashin's sword wrote declarative sentences in sparks. The skull-helmed champion blocked with a weapon that had seen cathedrals burn and hadn't minded. Purity seals tore and fluttered. Cashin didn't notice. He took a blow on the pauldron, pivoted, and put his blade through the man's elbow joint with a patience that felt like contempt. The blade came free red and hot. The champion reeled. Cashin followed as if following were the only thing he'd ever learned and the first thing he had mastered. Tim's opponent pressed with the arrogance of weight. He fed that weight bad footing. A feint toward the Crozius, a low sweep to the ankle, a step to where the runelight had just died and left slick stone. The chain axe carved a happy semicircle through empty air and hit a nail guard with a sound that made teeth complain. Tim used the rebound, jumped, planted his staff's tip against a ceiling rib, and came down behind the man. The next strike went into a joint that didn't like being reminded it existed. He felt something give. The man's laugh dropped an octave. Kara's second ring fizzled, sparked, and tried to draw from her the way a thirsty engine tries to sip a storm. She let it have heat without structure, light that didn't carry a command, smiling slightly when the rune outsmarted itself and surges burned out 3 sigils at once. "You don't get to tell me what I'm for," she told the floor, and the floor, exhausted, obeyed. Victor crawled under a metal dais and spoke to a bus that had been forced into blasphemy. "You're overclocked," he whispered. "Your casing aches. You have a crack you're pretending not to." He changed ground and inserted a loop that made sense. A relay clicked in gratitude. Heat bled off into harmless bars in the wall. Somewhere in the labyrinth of copper, a machine spirit sighed. On the dais, the hooded man, Dark Apostle, the weight of the title carried its own weather, tilted his head. His voice didn't rise. It only found them where their names lived. "Little candle," he said, and Tim's skin pebbled with a reflex he refused to have. The Apostle's eyes, when the hood fell back, were calm and full of someone else's reflection. He lifted the Crozius and pointed it lazily at Wren. "Daughter of hunger, my choir has a place for you." Wren's mouth made almost a smile that had nothing to do with happiness. "Your choir sings off-key," she said. She took a step back not because she feared him but because fear is a tool if you fit it properly. The locket burned cold against her throat. She left it on. Keen's troopers held the mouth of the corridor with ugly, beautiful precision. One of hers went down with a hole through his thigh and did not scream. The woman next to him dragged him back by the harness and stuffed a coagulant ampoule into the wound with her teeth. "Later," she told him, which was a prayer. The skull-helmed brute Tim fought changed tactics, ripped off his own helm, and spat a curse that carried a taste like burnt sugar and nails. The room leaned. Tim's knee nearly betrayed him. Vane's device whined high and the tilt eased. The brute grinned with broken teeth and swung for Tim's head. Tim let the haft pass an inch from his mask, hooked the man's wrist with the staff's crook, and slammed his shoulder into a pillar. The man's arm popped out of its socket with a noise like stepping on wet wood. He screamed the rest of the curse and it came out a sob. "Two," Victor called, tightening a clamp with the side of his palm. "I've turned 2 of the nails into paperweights. Third is stubborn." "Compliment it," Lexam suggested, earnest and terrible. They respond to affirmation. "Your solder work is exquisite," Victor told the nail. He wasn't entirely joking. It hummed in an offended key, then relented half a volt. Logan's River curved around a chanting knot. He slid in as a boy and came out as a snake, coiling near ankles without touching, a green threat that made men step away from where stepping wrong would break the pattern Wren was shepherding. "Left," he said, because words still work even when you feel like an animal. "Left, then straight. You're doing great. You can hate me later for saying that." Kara found the third ring's flaw where it kinked around a broken tile. She fed that kink a little sun, precisely wrong, and the rune sulked itself to death. The air pressure eased like a fever remembering how to go away. She sagged 2 inches in the air without meaning to, then steadied. The apostle watched her with interest and put 2 fingers to his mouth. He didn't whistle. The 2 armored lieutenants who were still alive shifted in the way of men who had just remembered their careers had odds. They closed to shield him. Cashin came for them like a verdict. His sword met theirs and decided, sparks drawing bright punctuation in the air. "Wren," the apostle said, and this time he didn't say her name the way other people did. He said part of the one she kept in a locked box with padding around it. It stole the first half syllable of her breath. She blinked as if someone had thrown dust in her eyes. The chant under the floor lunged at the opening. Tim didn't look at her. He didn't need to. "With me," he said, simple, ordinary, the kind of rope you toss without fanfare. "We're halfway. Plan says we get to 3 before we improvise." Wren's breath found itself where it had been. The box held. She pressed her palms out a fraction, and the tug at the chant's edges became resistance again instead of invitation. 3, she said, more to the room than to him. "You always were a greedy number." The third nail's hum changed. Victor smiled despite the sweat on his lip. "There," he said. "Now be stubborn about the right thing." He looked up, eyes unfocusing, talking to whoever in the walls deigned to listen. "When this is over, you get proper shielding and a song in 12/8. "Make it November 8th, Lexam sighed, head cocked, lenses serene. "It feels like a city." The second skull-helmed brute tried to shoulder past Tim to get at Wren. Tim put a foot behind his heel and a staff across his chest and made Mass tell the truth. The man crashed against an iron rail and felt for the first time that day like maybe he was a person and not an inevitability. He swung without aim. Tim ducked and the Crozius passed over him to hit the rail and exploded into sparks. The sparks were pretty and irrelevant. Tim caught the haft as it rebounded and yanked. The Crozius skittered away across the floor. The brute made the mistake of looking at it instead of at Tim. Tim put him down, not pretty and not cruel. The apostle stopped being amused. He stepped off his dais without bending his knees and the floor tried to rise to meet him. Vane's device screamed thinly in protest. "You make admirable toys," the apostle observed. Crozius idling in his grip like a second heart. "You will love them even as they cut your hands." "Occupational hazard," Vane said, and threw the device's radius wider. Knives all around the room shone like they had been polished. Syllables lost their sugar. The apostle's eyes narrowed as if someone had turned down his favorite instrument in the mix. Keen's perimeter buckled and held. A zealot charged in, mouth open for a litany with a knife the length of a forearm. Keen's second shot broke the knife. Her first had broken the wrist holding it. "I said later," she told the world, and her troopers laughed without humor and steadied again. Kara's fourth ring fought harder. It tried to catch her light and thread it into the chant. She changed the color, not to her eye but to the runes. Shifted it just off the band it could taste. The line flared, pouted and died. The anchor's breath hitched. The nails sang a note that was not triumph. It sounded suspiciously like surprise. The floor under the dais cracked along a seam that had been waiting. Heat sighed upward. Through the grate below, Tim saw something move that was not light and not shadow. The chamber under this chamber, then the true weight, the deeper nails. This room had been the hands. The wrists were below. We just made it angry, Logan said, because he could smell moods in air and metal the way other people smell rain. Good, Tim said, chest heaving, staff ticking against the floor once. Angry things make mistakes. The apostle lifted his crozius. Some mistakes, he said gently, are the plan. He struck the floor with the butt. The sound crawled into the crack and down. The grate redlined. A wave of heat hit them like a confession. Cashin tore his blade free of a dying man and turned toward the apostle without needing to be told. The jump pack fired. The apostle met him with a parry that should not have been possible with a stick that glowed. Sparks wrote clashing scripture in the air. Cashin pressed. The apostle smiled with someone else's pain. Vane's device coughed smoke. It'll hold, he said, lying like a priest telling a tired family the weather will be better tomorrow, and believing it long enough for it to be useful. Wren looked at the grate. The pressure there was a hand testing the lock. The locket burned colder. She did not take it off. She pressed her palm toward the seam and spoke to it the way you speak to a frightened animal that might be a wolf. Not yet, she said. Not today. Victor slapped the last clamp into place and threw a breaker. 3 of the 4 upper nails shifted their load into the walls with a groan that shook old dust out of prayers. The 4th screamed metal hate and refused. Stubborn, he said through his teeth, and then, because Lexam was right and machines deserved courtesy, please. The nail hummed in a new key. It wasn't yes yet. It was thinking about it. Kara dropped to the floor beside Tim, chest shining with heat, eyes bright from the inside. Say the word, she said. Charges, Tim answered, pulling a flat packet from his belt. He slapped it to the 4th nail's brace and keyed a remote. Non-structural. We're not dropping a cathedral on refugees. Try not to drop it on us either, Logan said, herding a last clutch of civilians past Keen's line. My mom hates when I come home with rubble. The apostle's crozius came down on Cashin's pauldron and made a crater. Cashin's blade repaid the favor in a ribbon of scar across the apostle's chest. Neither man bled like people. Both breathed like furnaces. The floor under the dais cracked again, a long wet sound like ice under boots. Something below them laughed the way steam laughs when it meets cold iron. Wren closed her eyes and set her breath to the city's noise above and the chamber's noise below and braided them into something like a rope. She held it with both hands without touching it. Do it, she said. Tim hit the trigger. The charge kicked like a mule wearing a ring of bells. The brace blew a foot sideways. The nail took its new alignment like a grudge and then, slowly, reluctantly, settled into the job Victor had written on it. The room's pressure dropped a hair. The chant lost its center of gravity and stumbled 2 beats. Top ring is ours, Victor said, exhale half a laugh. Everything from here on feeds slower. The apostle rolled his shoulders as if shrugging off a coat. Then you will come down, he said pleasantly, and waved the crozius. The dais split. A section of floor slid back with a grating purr, revealing a stair that was never meant for the public. Heat lapped up like a tongue. Cashin took a step toward it the way a cliff leans into weather. Keen swore like a blessing. Vane looked at his device, at the opening, at Wren, and measured a dozen prices in a blink. Tim met the apostle's eyes and saw nothing but patience. He wants us lower, Tim said, quiet enough that only the circle heard. He needs the room that likes him best. Good, Kara said, lifting again. I am tired of rooms that think they get a vote. Wren opened her eyes. The locket bit her skin and she let it. We go, she said. We keep the book from turning while we pry its spine. Keen, hold the mouth, Vane ordered. No one in behind us. Sergeant Cashin. With you, Cashin said, because some answers don't need orders to exist. Tim checked charge count and found too few. He tucked the last 2 where his hands would find them in a hurry. Vex, bring the song. Logan, river turns into a waterfall if it has to. Fast, not chaotic. You're mixing metaphors, Logan said. Grin quick and feral. I'm mixing survival, Tim said, and the grin came back at him. They moved to the stair the apostle had opened like a dare. Heat breathed on their faces. The sound from below wasn't just chant anymore. It was rush and hiss and the intimate scrabble of claws in stone that might have been metaphor and might not. The apostle stepped backward into the glow as if the light held him up. Bring your angels, he said. Crozius resting on his shoulder like a shepherd's hook. Bring your toys. Bring your little candle. Wren didn't give him the courtesy of a look. She set her foot on the first step. The others followed. Above, Keen's line tightened. Vane's device ticked like a clock deciding how much longer to run. Below, the deeper anchor waited, patient as a grave that knows your name. Tim breathed once as if for the first time all day and went down, counting the things he could count and trusting the rest to the people who had made the world bigger than fear. Heat climbed the stairs to meet them, thick and sweet with a smell that pretended to be incense until you noticed the copper in it. The steps opened into an inverted cathedral, ribs of iron arched overhead, and at their nadir hung chains tangled with bells that had been welded shut. The floor wasn't floor, it was a lattice, and under it the world throbbed. Black nails as thick as columns plunged into stone around a central wound, and over that wound a cage of scripture and wire clattered as if learning to breathe. Runes crawled along rails, eating light like bread. The dark apostle waited just far enough ahead that their voices had to carry to reach him. He didn't turn. He let the room do the greeting, the push on the eardrums, the tilt in the ankles. Vane's device churred and the tilt flattened. It didn't banish the wrongness. It laid tracing paper over it and drew a cleaner outline. Left, Victor said, not looking with his eyes, just with that quiet in his jaw that meant the machines were talking. Coolant pumps behind that grate. They're starving. If they stop, the rails get hot enough to make prayers boil. Logan, Tim said, already peeling a charge from his belt and sinking a hand under the lattice for purchase. Vent shaft, size of your shoulders, 4 meters in. Be a bat. Watch for practices that think your lunch. Logan grinned because there are only 2 ways to step into nonsense and laughter's cheaper. He dropped to his belly, rolled through the lattice, shrank mid-fall, and flickered into the shaft as if the dark were a familiar suit. The grate rattled once, then stilled. Cashin stepped past the edge of Tim's vision and became the room's new center. The Crozius in the apostle's hand pivoted as if it had its own wrist. The 2 men regarded one another like weather systems trying to share a sky. Behind them, Lexam made a small sound of scientific heartbreak at the sight of nails big enough to be myths. Kara drifted higher for a view through heat shimmer, hair burning bright. Sigils feed from the cage, not the nails. The nails are anchors. The cage is the mouth. Then we clog the throat, Tim said. He wanted to put a palm on Wren's shoulder and didn't because she was using everything to stand. The locket sat at her throat like an argument she was losing and choosing anyway. Vex, repurpose anything that hums. Cashin, with me on whatever grows teeth first. Vane, keep the air honest. You tell the air to be honest, Vane said, and the corners of his mouth remembered how to be human for a quarter second. He tossed 2 small hexes to the floor. They clacked into place and bled smoke that made the rune light waver. The apostle finally turned. The scars on his face had been written like a letter so many times the parchment no longer cared what ink you used. I admire the industry, he said. Children so busy in a ruin. Cashin's reply was a jump pack roar. It painted great fans of hot wind over the rails and threw the apostles' row back. Their first clash was not a sound so much as an edit to the paragraph the world was writing. Sparks skittered and died screaming. The cage bars above the wound brightened with the attention. Vane's device keened. The rail's runes dropped an octave, as if embarrassed. Wren pressed her palms out and the pressure at her teeth slacked a half measure. She set her breath to a different count and the chorus under the floor lost a step. Victor slid on his knees to a control box the size of a coffin and kissed a wire with his interface. You're overheating, he whispered to it, tone-pitched for one listener. You're trying so hard. Let me help. Lights chased one another inside the casing, red to yellow to a grudging green. He grinned, not because it was funny, but because something in the box believed him. Logan's voice filtered up the shaft, small and tinny. Pumps are cavitating. Valve wheel is stuck. I can be an octopus or a gorilla, your call. Octopus, Victor said without thinking. You'll get better torque. 8 hands, coming up, Logan said cheerfully, because he was a problem set that liked you back. They were moving. They were always moving. The rail's heat bled sideways into channels Victor opened with his voice and fingertips. Kara punched light into the cage at the exact wrong rhythm for anything ritual to consume. Tim met a horned guard on a precipice half a meter wide and treated him like an answer with no work shown. Just a mark struck through. The guard stumbled backward over nothing and did not finish the question he'd started. Wren didn't step. She stood. Standing was not passive. Standing was work. Standing was saying no with every muscle, every breath, every beat under her tongue that wanted to gallop to a different song. The wound below pushed on her as if to measure her size and found too much city in her to count quickly. Above them, where Keen held the mouth of the stair, the long line of gray coats breathed as one. Keen thumbed blood off her cheek and told a trooper to aim lower. A sister hospitaller pressed a palm to a guardsman's ribs and whispered names like a lullaby for pain. Someone started humming very quietly and was surprised when others picked it up. Not a hymn with doctrine, just a tune about getting to the end of a day with most of your shape intact. Kara's Saint card glinted on 3 coat fronts and then 5 and then a dozen, each one worn with embarrassment and relief. Hold, Keen said, as if everyone had considered not, and they did, and that counted as faith where they came from. The apostle angled his Crozius toward Wren without looking away from Cashin. All gates are named for something and someone, he said. This one knows yours. Then it can practice pronunciation on the air, Wren said. The locket burned. She let it. She didn't take her eyes off the place where the rails turned to smoke over the wound. The name of the thing that matters is not mine. Cashin pressed him. The Marine fought like a man who had once been asked if he knew what he was for, and had replied yes in a sentence made of steel. The apostle yielded a meter, not a concession. An invitation to a worse room he carried with him. You bleed impressively, the apostle said, glancing at the ruin his Crozius had made of Cashin's pauldron. Duty does not end, Cashin said, and drove the blade into the space between 2 books of scar scripture and made a new line. The cage didn't crack, not yet. It sang. The song had the shape of a trap that had been polite long enough. The runes across the rails aligned into a lace that leaned over the wound like a crowd at a balcony. Victor swore once, quick and pious. It's learning, he said. It's writing countermeasures. Write faster, Tim said, because encouragement is a tactic. Logan's voice rose, strained. If anyone asks, I am not an HVAC professional, he grunted. But your pumps have very specific feelings about being coaxed. Turning now. The rail's heat dropped a degree. Another. The rune lace stuttered. The cage over the wound flickered a fraction slower, like a breath someone hadn't noticed they were holding. A pair of robed acolytes rushed the lattice with knives whose blades had scripture etched on both sides. Vane's first shot cut the nearer blade in half mid-sprint. The second took the wrist that insisted on keeping going. Stay in the story, he said, and to Tim's surprise, it didn't sound like cruelty. Story says we hit the clamps, Tim agreed, and pointed at the cage's corner where 3 bars met a boss studded with aquilas. Kara was already halfway there, a streak you only saw because of what it lit in passing. She hammered heat into the stud until it turned glass skin thin. Tim slammed the staff into it once, twice. The stud cracked, shrieked, and let go with a sound like a cathedral clearing its throat. The cage shifted. The wound spat light in a sheet that scalded the air between them. Wren's hands flattened. No, she said, not loud. The sheet curled like paper held to a candle and turned back on itself. The light didn't love that. It scrabbled along the rails and sulked into the drain channels Victor had given it. The apostle saw the cage move and stopped being almost amused. He chopped for Tim's head in a strike that had manners and came at the second place Tim could be. Tim took it on the haft, bones ringing from fingers to shoulder, and ducked under a return that would have ended who he was but not what he meant, which felt like an unacceptable trade. Cashin caught the aftermath on his blade and pivoted the Crozius away from Ren with a movement that left paint on the air. The apostle's eyes narrowed the way a teacher's do when a student doesn't get the answer wrong the expected way. "You will tire," he told Ren. "Everyone does," she said, and smiled like someone who has found the joke in that and forgives the day for it. Lexam scuttled close enough to Victor to make him flinch. "If we sever the central bus," the Muggo said, "we deprive it of a language. It will try to reinvent one. We must be rude and quicker." "Be ruder," Victor said, and yanked a braided ribbon of optic line from a prayer-girded socket. Alarms argued in 4 keys. He bridged 2 contacts with a sliver of his own interface and hissed, "Hot. Hot. Okay, talk to me, you stubborn him. You are not allowed to spell like that." Above, a shock rattled dust from the staircase vault, Keen's line taking a hit and pushing it back. "On your feet," Keen snapped, and 3 troopers stood before they remembered they'd been thinking of other options. Someone laughed, a cracked thing that sounded like Courage's little brother. Logan hauled himself out of the shaft, soaked and grinning, and shook water off his hair like a dog. "Pumps are singing. Off-key but singing." "Keep them in the choir," Victor said. Sweat carved pale lines down his temples. "Kara, give me 2 seconds of color at 3 o'clock. She flashed a pulse against empty air. The color wasn't a color human eyes care about. The rune lace did, and its neat pattern threw a tantrum, lines snarling and looping into nonsense. Victor rammed a wedge of metal into a clamp and locked the nonsense in place. "There. Tell a different truth." The apostle took a step and the lattice under his foot straightened as if proud to hold him. "You make a little fortress," he said, not to Tim. "To Ren. But you stand on a shore. The sea has forever." "Then I must be very patient," Ren said. The wound below tried a new game. It pulled quiet out of the air, tugged at the spaces between sounds until silence grew heavy and hurt the ears. Ren's breath lost itself for a beat. Tim said, very gently, "T," and the word had no power except the ones they'd all assigned to it. Presence, warmth, the cheap miracle of time to swallow a sip. She blinked, and silence lost its teeth. The cage needed one more insult. Tim pointed to the far boss where a bundle of gleaming cables fed power and story into the bars. "I can't get to it," he said. The path was a ridiculous catwalk that took a ridiculous turn over a ridiculous drop and ended at a platform small enough for bad decisions. "I can," Logan said, already shrinking into a monkey with fingers made for risk. He scampered out with a laugh that felt like when a coin comes up the way you called it. Halfway across, a rivet popped with a ping. The catwalk dipped. He flattened, tail lashing for balance, found a weld with new faith and kept going. The apostle pivoted toward him. Cashin put his sword where the Crozius wanted to be. "Here," Cashin said, as if annoyed his opponent had forgotten the address. Sparks sentenced gravity to a moment in time. The apostle glanced back, faintly irritable, and met the Marine with both hands on the haft and a twist that turned weight into leverage. The Crozius kissed Cashin's helm and left a comet smear of light. Logan hit the boss and bared monkey teeth at it, which was not helpful, and pulled anyway. The bundle resisted. He dug his heels into scored metal and leaned his weight. The cable creaked, stretched, and parted with a sound like a snapped promise. The cage stuttered another second. The wound spat a claw of absence that reached for Logan like a long memory. Kara was faster. She slammed a palm up, poured light into nothing to make it show its edges, and the claw hit the light like a glass thrown at a wall. It shattered without making shards. Logan flinched and cackled. "You, me, sugar rush," he said to her, breathless, and scampered back along the catwalk because you do not learn the wrong lesson from being lucky. Tim felt the pressure shift under his feet. The nails hummed a new low chord, not full surrender, but the sound an engine makes when you take your foot off its throat. Heat bled through Victor's channels, and the rail's runes struggled to keep their lace neat. The cage sagged a finger's width. It was ugly and uneven and perfect. The apostle stopped smiling behind his scars. He glanced at Vane's device as if considering the bothersome pebble in his shoe and leveled a hand at it. The air between palm and device turned the wrong temperature. The device coughed smoke like a dying book burning its last page. Vane stepped forward and put his own body between the Crozius and the hex, as if he had decided to be the page instead. Not yet, he told the day. The Crozius met Cassion's blade with a full-armed slam. The shockwave ran up Tim's bones. A hairline crack skittered along the lattice, darted beneath Wren's feet, and kissed the base of a nail. She frowned at it as if offended by its manners, and the crack forgot what it had been trying to be. Charges are gone, Tim said, checking his belt and finding very little. We do the rest with hands. I prefer hands, Kara said, burning quietly. I prefer any situation where I have one more tool than I need, Victor said, wrenching a final wedge into place and letting out a breath that sounded like a prayer someone wouldn't write down. The wound gathered itself, not bigger, but more itself. It leaned on Wren like a door does on a shoulder. The locket bit. She didn't take it off. She didn't take it off because that was the game on offer, the bargain in glitter, and she had already decided which door she was holding. You can have me, she told the opening in the world, if you can carry every name I'm carrying. Start with the easy ones. She whispered Keen. She whispered the boy under the market table with the wooden saint. She whispered the tram that forgave Victor. She whispered the tune the guardsmen had hummed without daring to call it a hymn. The pressure changed flavors. It didn't like that list. It didn't know what to do with it. Tim saw that and understood the next page before anyone else did. The cage was dropping. The rails were sulking. The nails were tired in the way of metal that had been forced to tell lies. The wound would try to change the room to a shape it could win inside. That meant stairs. That meant the underchamber. That meant the gate, the true one, the one with teeth on both sides. We're going lower, he said, and the awful thing was how relieved the room seemed at the courtesy of being predicted. The apostle took a single step back. The lattice under his feet unfolded like a tongue, bridging to a black stair that had not been there and had always been waiting. Come then, he said, as gracious as an invitation to a banquet. Bring your patience. Bring your angels. Bring your soft, brave lies. Cassion's jump pack flared. Vane shook his device like a man urging a heart to remember its job, and it did for now. Victor pressed his palm to the control box one last time and whispered, "Hold on to the new song." Logan wiped grease on his cheek and grinned at nobody. Kara looked up through the heat shimmer as if checking the color of the sky she would bring down here if she had to. Wren lifted her hands, and the air lifted, and the rope she'd made of a city's breath tightened. Down, she agreed, and in the word there was no surrender. They took the new stair with the careful speed of people running toward a fire to keep it from eating a house. The cage above them complained. The wound sulked and waited. Below, something laughed, not at them, but as if it had read ahead and liked the ending. Tim didn't. He planned to change it. The stair turned into a tongue of black iron and licked them into a chamber that had never been meant for feet. The heat changed from oven hot to kiln steady, the kind that makes pottery remember it used to be mud. Overhead, ribs of metal bowed toward a pit where the world had been taught to sag. Chains hung like lines from a bad draft. Bells welded shut dotted them like punctuation that said pray in a dialect of silence. The wound here wasn't a tear anymore. It was a well with light around the rim and darkness at the center, a coin mouth waiting to be fed. It's hung on 4 roots, Victor said, without looking like he was looking. Quadrant clamps feeding into a central gyre. The gyre is a story eating itself. Then we cut the roots and starve the story, Tim said. Pairs. Kara with me on the near right. Vex with Logan left. Cassion anchors center with our friend. Wren. Wren stepped to the lip of where the floor pretended to end. The Sinol locket burned cold enough to frost her breath in a place that should have boiled it. I'll keep the page from turning. Don't ask me to read it. I won't, Tim said. Vane. The interrogator turned his hex in his hands as if he could massage a few more minutes of virtue from brass. I can thicken the air and thin the chant, he said. It will make kills cleaner and miracles harder. I will accept the trade. Keen, Tim said into his vox bead. Static answered first, then Keen's voice, clipped and gravelly, the way it gets when you've chewed smoke and shouted orders for too long. Still holding the mouth, she said. Lost too. Got 3 back from the line who swear they're fine. They're not fine. We're fine. Your poetry, Logan told the bead, and cut the channel before Keen could threaten to shoot him on principle. The Dark Apostle waded across a narrow causeway of grating. Crozius balanced on his shoulder like a shepherd's hook. The rails around him drew light inward as if they'd been smeared with gravity. He smiled like someone who didn't smile often and remembered how for the wrong reasons. There are so many kinds of courage, he said. Today you've brought stubbornness. I approve. Cashin's jump pack thundered and carved wind off the grating. He didn't speak. He gave the Apostle something better to answer, and the man obliged, stepping into the blow with a lazy precision no sermon had a right to own. Sparks wrote curlicues over the pit. The bells didn't ring. They wanted to. Kara lifted, palm fire shivering on a heat that wasn't hers. Tim, she said softly, and he understood. Her light wanted to be eaten. She would have to feed it wrong. Offbeat, he said. Make the cage choke. They hit the first root clamp like locksmiths who had decided to be honest. The clamp was a block of stamped scripture welded around a bundle of cables fat as thighs. Kara rolled warmth in pulses, nothing for the clamp to grip, everything for the metal to resent. Tim hammered the seams, not to break them, but to embarrass them into letting go. Scripture cracked. Light bled. A rivet squealed its soul into the air and popped. On the far side, Victor slid to a panel on his knees and kissed a filament with his interface. You don't have to carry that, he told the cabling. You can be a bridge instead of a mouth. Lights inside the casing hiccuped, red to amber to a wondering green. He breathed with it until the green stopped blinking. Logan became a spider without preamble, scuttled under the assembly, and wedged a chunk of scrap where a hinge threatened to remember its job. Torque, he said, and became a gorilla in the same heartbeat. 2 hands yanking the wheel while 6 legs held the world still for him. The wheel turned with a religious groan. The clamp loosened. Cashin and the Apostle rode a disagreement across the catwalk. The Marine moved like doctrine. The Apostle moved like rumor. Cashin's blade kissed the Crozius and left a bright line on darkness. The Crozius came down on the pauldron Cashin had left as a decoy. The pauldron dented. Cashin did not. He answered with a thrust so plain it was rude. The Apostle laughed because the plain things always surprised him. Vane knelt near the pit and set the hex on the iron. It flashed, not with light, but with a memory of winter. The air lost a flavor. Knives looked honest. The gyre's edge flickered, less eager to gulp. Vane's shoulders sank a fraction, as if a weight had agreed to share itself. Wren stood without stepping and felt the rhythm under her feet try to make a map of her pulse. No, she told it. You don't get to lead. She thought of tram schedules spoken in a kind voice. She thought of Keen saying hold like it was a coin she could spend. She set her breath to the tune the guardsmen had hummed without calling it a hymn. The wound tugged. The rope held. The first clamp let go with a sound like a jar unsticking. The floor shuddered, not pleased. Heat rolled out in a resentful sigh. Tim could feel the gyre below adjust, taking on more load. It didn't slow. It concentrated. 3 to go, Victor called, already crawling to the next panel. Left quadrant's smarter. I hate it when geometry gets ideas. Tell it to pick on someone its own shape, Logan said, becoming a hawk and skating a meter above a ribbon of blue fire that sketched itself out of nowhere, hissed, and vanished where Wren's breath said stop. Kara curved upward to scout. The air glittered with dust that wasn't dust. Points of not quite light drifting toward the gyre like dandelion seed heads. There are voices in the heat, she said, eyes the color of furnace stone. They're not words. They're invitations. Decline, Tim said. She smiled, bare and fierce, and rolled her palms. The invitations met a wall of wrong rhythm warmth and parted like fog before a taxi. She dropped, hammering the second clamp with pulses that refused to make sense. The script tried to weave around that refusal. It tangled in itself and burned. Vane's hex coughed smoke. He hissed between his teeth and palmed a second charm from inside his robe. Smaller, meaner, etched deep with sigils tired men had carved while praying they'd never be used. He clipped it to the first and breathed out a word that cost him something. The air thickened. The gyre's rim hiccuped. Somewhere far above, a bell tried to ring and remembered it had been welded into obedience. The apostle stopped entertaining. He slid past Cassion's guard with a twist that used the marine's weight like a polite door, and brought the Crozius around for Ren. Tim's staff met it in the air with a sound that made his forearms want to become someone else's problem. He felt the aftertaste of other rooms on the haft. Cathedrals that had burned, bridges that had buckled, bones that had learned the physics of losing. He took a step that shorted all those memories and fed the Crozius force back into itself. The apostle blinked, the first clumsy moment he'd allowed himself in a century. Cassion filled it with steel. "You will tire," the apostle told Ren again, conversational over the sound of metal regretting things. "You will all tire, and then the story will finish writing itself." "Then we had better be done first," Ren said, and she smiled as if the idea amused her after all. The second clamp's lock pin snapped and pinged into the pit. The gyre's edge folded higher on one side, a smile crooked the wrong way. Heat sucked inward, greedy, then halted in a stutter as Victor strangled a feed with a loop of his own interface and a prayer in 11/8. Hold, good," he crooned, and the machine held because sometimes being believed is the only reason you need. Logan flared as a bat and found the vertical duct he needed. He slid into it on a skin of squeaks and came out at the third clamp already a man with a wrench in his hand. "This one's fused shut," he said, voice thin against the roar from the gyre. "Also, it hates me personally." "Reciprocate," Tim said. Logan bared his teeth. "I was planning on it." He jammed the wrench into a gap that didn't want to admit it existed and put his back into it. Metal groaned. The wrench slipped. His hand mashed between handle and housing, skin going the wrong color. He grimaced, normalized the hand back into something with more fingers than human anatomy technically endorses, and turned again. The clamp's faceplate tore, offended, and came away in a sheaf, bolts screaming their opinion. Cassion drove the apostle back a stride. Then another. The Crozius licked his helm and left a comet smear. His blade answered with an exclamation point down the apostle's ribcage. Blood came that didn't look like it belonged in light. It smoked when it hit the grating. The apostle's laugh had less in it. Vane said almost to himself, "I do not have another hex." He said it like a man noting the end of the column in a ledger and deciding he would make the numbers work anyway. He put his bare hand on the first device and fed it heat. His fingers blistered, then blackened, and he did not move them. "Don't," Ren said without turning. "Later," Vane replied, and the word was a promise he was making to himself about all of them. The third clamp turned and stalled and turned, every degree a negotiation. When it let go, the gyre dipped like a table losing a leg, and the light at its rim pulled in long tongues toward the center. The wound below tried to stand like a man rising from water for the first time and discovering it had legs. Ren's breath snagged. The rope thinned. She could feel the room finding her name by feel. The apostle felt it too. "There," he said softly, and it was almost tender, a teacher noticing brilliance a child didn't know they had. "There you are." Tim didn't give him the second half of the sentence. He slammed the staff into the grating and jolted the room's balance a fraction. Kara dropped like a meteor and hammered a wash of light across the apostle's reach. It wasn't an attack. It was a glare that made depth lose its depth for a heartbeat. Cassion used that white blank to drive his sword home under the apostle's guard. The blade bit, stopped, bit again, and found purchase in a place that should have been bone and wasn't. "Fourth," Victor said, "because life insists on math when drama wants to monologue." Far side. The far clamp crouched on a platform barely wide enough for two bodies and a mistake. The path to it was a thread of grating hung over the gyre, cross-braced by nothing but stubbornness. The heat rising there had a shape, as if hands were doing the lifting. "I'll go," Tim said. "Obviously I'm coming," Kara said. "Take him," Ren said, and put a palm on Tim's shoulder. "Not for him, for timing. 3 beats from now." He listened. 1, 2, 3, he and Kara ran. The grating flexed the way bridges always do when you remember that trust is a verb. The air clawed at their faces. The wound below pulled and promised and made both sensations into reasons to stop. Kara shoved warmth outward without letting it become a beam. The pull slid off. Tim hit the platform, rolled the momentum into his knees, and stood where the clamp could see that he meant this as a conversation with only one ending. "Kiss it," Kara said. "I'm buying it dinner first," Tim said, and laid the staff's haft against the script lines like a tuning fork. The lines pulsed with their borrowed him. He found the wrong note and pushed. Kara fed warmth into the weld's wronger. The faceplate sighed. Bolts cracked. The clamp did what all clamps do when the right two people ask nicely and mean it. It let go. The gyre sagged on all four sides at once. The rim scrabbled inward, then out, then inward again, undecided. It was still a mouth, but now it had to choose whether to bite or breathe. Vane's hex flared and died with a sad little pop. His hand smoked. He left it where it was. "Now," he said through his teeth, not to them, to the room. "Now you stop." The apostle took 2 steps back, Crozius low, eyes on Ren. "I know your name," he said, and this time he said it, half of it, in a shape that made the hair along Tim's arms want to stand. The rope jumped in Ren's hands. The wound surged at that jump like a fish taking a fly. Ren didn't look at him. She looked up through iron and stone and smoke to where she imagined the basilica must be. The steps, the fountain used for a triage table, the sisters' tired hands, Keen's back like a line drawn with a ruler. She opened her mouth and borrowed the city's breath. It came imperfect and many. 12 prayers without the words. 100 Dantai Odar. 1,000 I am not done. It wasn't pretty. It wasn't clean. It was enough. Ren braided them into something that would hold weight for a minute and threw it over the gyre like a net. The wound hit it and hissed, not in pain but in surprise. The lights around the rim guttered. The bells overhead wanted to ring badly enough that the welds groaned. Tim felt the platform under his boots decide it was tired of being anywhere and changed its mind back because Kara was there and made believing easier for things not smart enough to decide. Cassian pressed the apostle into a corner he had brought with him and broke the corner. The Crozius met the blade and lost a scrap of its false shine. The blade met the Crozius and paid with a chip along its edge. They both bled the way mountains do, slowly with intent. The apostle flicked a look past Cassian at Ren, annoyed to find that irritation could exist in him. "Little candle," he began. Tim wasn't the one to answer. Vane spoke, voice raw. "Her light is not yours to name." He stood, hand still smoking, and leveled a bolt pistol not at the apostle, but at a support strut the apostle had been unconsciously using for leverage. The shot ripped through iron. The leverage died. Cassian's next stroke went home. The gyre convulsed. The rim collapsed inward and sprang back, like a lung trying to remember who taught it breathing. The clamps, unplugged, spat flickers into drains Victor had opened. The wound did not close. It sulked and held. "We bought minutes," Victor said, panting, both palms flat to the panel as if at prayer. "Maybe 5. Maybe 20 if the city keeps singing. Then we spend them," Tim said. He turned. Ren had gone paler than the locket, but her eyes were clear the way ice is clear over dark water. "What's left?" "The page," she said. "It thinks it knows where the sentence ends." "Then we write a different end," Kara said, and smiled like sunrise through smog. The apostle straightened as if his spine had remembered new tricks. He lifted the Crozius to his shoulder and took a single step toward the pit. "You have been diverting," he said, and there was genuine appreciation in it. "But all this has purchased is a better view." He stepped off the grating and didn't fall. The air learned a lesson and held him. He walked out over the gyre like a man crossing a stream and turned, offering them the world's worst invitation. "Come," he said. "If you would keep your city, take it back from the inside." Tim felt the decision arrive. It was a different kind of dangerous than any fight. There was no guard to read, no joint to strike, only belief and a broken machine. He looked at his team. Logan wiped grease and blood into a single smear and grinned because what else do you do? Victor's fingers shook once and steadied. Kara was already lifting. Cassian set his feet and looked at the apostle as if at a door that would not stay shut. Vane reloaded with his burnt hand and did not hiss because he had decided not to. Ren unclipped the locket. She didn't put it away. She held it in her fist like a coin she might still need to pay with. If I go first, she said, it will try to keep me. Then don't go first, Tim said. Go with me. He stepped onto the air. It was like stepping on a word you'd rehearsed in your mouth all morning. Slippery, then firm the moment you commit. Kara's warmth cupped the step and made it less impossible. Ren followed. The air tried to be teeth. She showed it a list of names until it forgot what it had meant to bite. The others came, each in their way. Cashin with weight enough to convince the impossible to be load-bearing, Victor talking softly to the wrongness like it was a shuttle bogged on bad rails, Logan becoming lighter or heavier on instinct until the pitch felt like a boardwalk over a marsh. They reached the Apostle on his little bridge of lies above the gyre. He regarded them with that polite interest again, the kind that says I am not angry, I am inevitable. There is a gate below this throat, he said. You can close it for a while with tricks and strong arms. Or you can make it remember it was born to stay shut. How? Ren asked, and hated that she wanted to know. With a light you do not deserve, he said, and smiled. Or with a dark you will not survive. That's not a choice, Tim said. It is the only choice, the Apostle replied, and tipped his head as if in benediction. Decide quickly. The gyre swelled under their feet, not enough to throw them, enough to remind them that stories move whether you do or not. Above, a faint voice came down the stair. Keen, somewhere, shouting hold with all the ragged power of a human throat. Ren closed her eyes and heard 1,000 breaths suiciding into one song that did not believe in victory, only in not stopping. Plan, she said, eyes opening, voice steady. We use theirs. Tim nodded once, as if he'd been waiting for that sentence all day. We go to the gate and make it choke on us, he said. And when it swallows, we make it remember what it means to be full of people. The Apostle laughed softly. Yes, he said. Bring your little city. Let us see if it can teach hell its manners. He turned and walked into the lightless center. The air accepted him. The bridge held. Tim looked back once toward the stair, toward the weight of stone and steel and the street they'd fallen onto at the beginning of a worse day. He didn't say goodbye. He didn't need to. He took a breath like a man about to dive and stepped forward with his team and their borrowed song, toward a gate that liked to be open and would, for a few minutes, learn how to shut. The bridge of air flexed under their weight like a word you almost mispronounce and then get right by meaning it. Heat licked their boots from below. The gyre pulled with that patient greed rivers have on bad days. Tim kept the count in his head where fear couldn't reach. Kara's warmth cupped their steps just enough to make the impossible remember it could hold them. Ren did not look at the dark. She looked at the people whose breath she had borrowed and at the shape of a sentence she intended to end differently than the book wanted. At the midpoint, the dark Apostle stopped. Light from the rim sketched his scars into a map no one sane would follow. There, he said, as if showing them a door, and beneath him the air thinned to reveal exactly that, a circle where nothing clung, a mouth that opened not outward but in. He stepped into it as if he had never done anything else. It was not falling. It was the sensation of a room turning itself inside out until the floor was above you and the ceiling was below, and both were square with your feet because they said they were. Tim's stomach tried to write a complaint. He stamped it with a number. The complaint forgot its point. They passed through a ring of cold that tasted metallic and came out onto a platform that pretended to be stone and knew it wasn't. Before them, the gate stretched. Not a door with jambs and lintel, but a long oval of deepening dark encircled by scripture that moved when you weren't looking. Victor put a hand to his chest as if to steady a tremor only he could feel. Signal loss, he said, half-laugh. Everything that talks is whispering. Tell it a story it can't swallow, Tim said. The Apostle stood on the gate's lip and held his crozius out over the dark like a man testing temperature before a swim. It has a price, he said pleasantly, as if they were haggling over fruit at a market. You cannot close it with cleverness. You cannot close it with steel. You may close it for a time with light you do not deserve, he glanced at Ren, and be marked by what you borrowed. Or you may shove it shut with darkness and be eaten for your work. Kara's mouth tilted. You sell both options as virtue, she said. I am bored. Boredom is a sin of peacetime, the apostle replied. This is mercy in war. Cashen lifted his blade as if the conversation were a distance he could cut. Enough. He stepped, and the apostle met him, and their first clash in this new chamber was less spark and more subtraction, as if the air here refused to carry evidence of argument. Their blows landed heavy and left no echo. It made every silence feel like a verdict. Ren moved to the edge and looked down. The dark was not empty. It had texture like velvet worn thin in places, and beneath those places she felt teeth arranged in patterns, as if someone had tiled a mouth with cathedral floors. The rope she had braided of breath and stubborn music stirred in her hands. If she threw it here, it would anchor for a moment, and then the room would remember bones stronger than rope. Her fingers tightened on the locket without thinking. She unclipped it because it was heavy in the wrong way, then kept it in her fist like a coin she might be forced to spend. Names, she whispered, not to the apostle, not even to the gate, but to the weave of fear in her own chest. Keen, Cashen, Vane, Lexham, the boy with the wooden saint, the woman who didn't shoot, the tram that forgave us, the old man with the kettle, Tim, Kara, Victor, Logan. Each one a stitch, the rope thickening with nothing the gate could digest cleanly. Vane crouched, both hexes guttering in his palm, and set them on the edge. I can make the air here temporarily allergic to miracles, he said. It will help your rope hold. It will also make what you are about to try harder. His hand shook once, then went still. We are out of better choices. We never had better choices, Tim said, and it came out calm because it was precisely true. Left and right, Victor murmured. There are vents. They breathe in. We need them to breathe out. I can ask, Kara said. Ask impolitely, Logan put in, because politeness had not saved anyone today. They took their places without Tim having to point. He did anyway. Habit and ritual carving fear into tasks. Kara drew heat in sketchlight strokes along the vents, reversing current a finger width at a time until air that had wanted to gulp started to cough. Victor pressed his interface against the rune-etched lip of the gate, hissed when it burned him, and stayed there until one stream of script peeled off and hung, confused, waiting for a grammar that would not arrive. Logan crossed himself in the irreverent way that means habit, not belief, and became a leopard to brace his weight against a mechanism that had never been meant to care about animal mass. It cared anyway. Cashen and the apostle struck a rhythm that had nothing to do with heartbeats. Cashen forced plane attacks into elegant defenses and made them choose to be clumsy. The apostle found the half-step nobody else could see and put his weight there until the world had to invent purchase for him. Neither tired like men. Both frayed like rope. Ren stepped 1 foot closer until the pulley line of the gate felt like it was hooked behind her breastbone. Time smudged. Sound went wrong at the edges. She thought of the cold coin in her hand and the threat it contained and chose without looking at it. You said I don't deserve it, she told the apostle without turning. You're right. The gate shivered under the admission, as if tasting confession and liking it. She smiled into the dark. So I won't take it. I'll borrow it from everyone else. She opened, not to the warp's choir, but to the city. It wasn't clean. It wasn't pretty. It was not a single light but 1,000 low flames caught in dirty glass. Kitchen stoves, altar candles, the orange of a cigarette cupped from the wind, the slow steady glow of a machine's pilot light that hadn't failed in 20 years. She invited them all, and they came reluctantly and then eagerly, because being useful is a kind of answer. The gate recoiled as if she'd offered it an argument instead of a meal. It wanted a saint or a sinner. It did not want a neighborhood. She advanced, palms out, and felt the rope thicken under her hands until it was no longer a thing she held but a thing she leaned into. On my count, she said, and Tim counted with her, quiet, steady, a metronome that knew when to swing. They pulled. Kara forced the vents to exhale. Hot air blasted outward, pushing against the gate's lip from behind. Victor lied to a line of scripture with a promise of a better ending, rerouted its power into a prayer wheel that did nothing but spin and waste time, which is sometimes victory. Logan became a mastiff and dug heels into plating and hauled a chain that protested in shrieks and then began to move because it had been asked with sufficient sincerity. Cashin feinted a drop and came up through the apostle's guard with an insultingly simple thrust that would have killed anyone else. The apostle took it like a man choosing to be wounded in order to be where he wished to be, and for an instant he was close enough to Ren to say her hidden name again. Half of it, the way a blade is half unsheathed. Tim said, soft, like a string tied around a finger to remember a human thing. Ren breathed, and the half-name died on the air. The gate fought back. It stopped being a mouth and became a hand, splaying fingers of pressure into their chests, trying to pry them apart and make them individuals again whole enough to digest. Vane's hex flared once, then failed entirely. He kept his palm on the dead brass out of spite. I do not believe in your God, he told the dark conversationally. I believe in audit. He dragged a knife across his blistered palm and flicked blood into the lip with the exacting neatness of a man who understood what gifts cost. The pressure faltered, not because blood is magic, but because intention is, in places like this, and Vane's intention had edges that knew where they were. The apostle pivoted away from Cashin and reached, not with his hands, but with the weight of his attention. The Crozius hummed with him fragments that had burned cities before they were songs. Ren's rope strained. It would hold if they pulled hard enough and long enough and if they didn't go to pieces. Kara made the vents cough harder, then laugh. You could hear it in the tone, a ragged chuff that belonged in a bar after a day of terrible work. Victor pressed his forehead to the lip and sang under his breath in a meter Lexham would have approved of, the kind of limping time that fits cities. Logan became a man again because hands grip better than paws in the end, and he hauled until tendons fluttered in his wrist like trapped birds. Cashin drew blood that smoked on the apostle's robe. The apostle answered with a blow that knocked the Marine to a knee and then another that should have taken his head and didn't because Tim put the staff where it needed to be, bending physics until it apologized. Almost, Ren said, and the word had every voice in it she'd braided that day. Almost. The gate made its last offer. It unscrolled memory not of temptation, but of relief, the quiet that would come if she let go, the ease of weight saved for someone else to carry. It let her imagine, for one awful heart-long beat, how it would feel to not be necessary. She wanted it. Desiring it did not undo her. She set the desire down like a hot kettle, reverent, and took hold again. Now, Tim said, because someone had to say it, and all their hands found a fraction more of whatever they kept for later. The rope dug into Ren's palms and then into the bones of her forearms and then into the place between her ribs where breath lives. She pulled with her mouth open and her teeth bared, a snarl that wasn't anger but effort with corners. Something at the gate's hinges remembered a different design. The lip hiccuped inward. The oval shivered like a muscle cramping and then doing as told. The scripture around it mispronounced itself, and in that mispronunciation found humility. It helped. The gate folded, not closed like a door, but drawn like curtains someone had washed and rehung carefully on the old rod. The apostle felt the change the way a swimmer feels tide. He lunged, Crozius low, toward the hinge that was failing, and would have gotten there if Cashin had not put his armored shoulder into the man's chest like a wall, finally remembering it is stronger than a man. Steel hit flesh that burned with a wicked light. The apostle staggered. His eyes, calm always, went bright with focus. He struck at Ren in a line that was all conclusion and no clause. Vane shot him through the bicep. It wasn't a kill. It wasn't meant to be. It bent the strike a degree. That degree put the Crozius into Tim's staff and not Ren's chest. Tim's arms sang with electric pain. He said through his teeth, because words can be stubborn too. The gate took their last handful of seconds and turned them into closing. The oval narrowed. The dark in the center tore like fabric stuck on a nail. The sound it made was not a scream. It was a sigh the size of the room, the size of the city, the size of regret. Heat dropped a degree. The welded bells overhead creaked as if insulted to be excluded from ceremony. Enough, the apostle said, and the word held earthquake, shipwreck, plague, and it still failed because 5 people and a city and a handful of angels and an exhausted inquisitor had decided there would be a different last word. The Crozius dimmed as the room's grammar shifted out from under it. Cashin's blade didn't brighten. It just kept doing its job. He drove it forward and through and down, and the apostle went with it, more surprise than anger in his face as the gate narrowed to a knife's width and made choosing a direction for his fall a courtesy he didn't get. He fell toward the dark with his hand outstretched, not for help, but because he would take it with him if he could. The Crozius kissed the lip as he went. A shower of sparks marked the measure. Then he was gone, and the gate was not. Silence had weight. It settled over them like a heavy blanket and then lightened when they remembered to breathe. The platform lurched as the gyre below coughed and then spun down through ugly harmonics to a steady, sullen grind. Kara let the vents fall into the ordinary work of moving air. Victor slumped against the lip and laughed once, a cracked sound that had joy in it anyway. Logan sat down where he stood and laid his head back and let the sweat run. Cashin wiped his blade on a scrap of robe that had not yet stopped smoking. Vane took his palm off his dead hex and watched, with remote curiosity, as new blisters raised where old ones had been. He seemed content with the exchange. Wren stood with her eyes closed. The rope lay in her hands like memory, like a story you could tell again if you had to. She opened her fingers. The locket gleamed like frost in her palm. She did not put it back on. She folded her thumb over it and hid it like a secret she chose to keep rather than a muzzle she had been forced to wear. "You saved lives," Vane said at last, voice hoarse. "That buys conversation." He holstered the pistol with the deliberateness of a man who might yet need it. He looked at Wren and didn't raise it. "It does not buy trust. But it buys time, which is rarer." "Time's good," Tim said. He flexed his fingers around the staff and made a face when his joints registered interest. "We spend it upstairs." They crossed the Bridge of Un, back through the cold ring, and up onto the lattice where heat had returned to being heat instead of invitation. The cage over the wound above had sagged into a dome of tired metal. Victor patted the control box like a dog that had done a difficult trick and deserved sausage. "You held," he told it. "I owe you a song." The stair-up was a climb through the aftermath. Keen's line was still there, thinner and shot through with new faces who had joined because lines are where people go when they decide to be themselves. She counted them in with her eyes and nodded as if she'd been expecting exactly this many all along. A sister hospitaller lowered her hands from a guardsman's face and allowed herself to sag for one breath before straightening again. "What did you break?" Keen demanded without waiting for greetings. "Something that was trying to break you first," Logan said, wiping both palms on his trousers and deciding not to shapeshift purely because it would be showing off. "Good," Keen said. "We have a city to keep. Also, my men think the tall one is a saint." She flicked her eyes at Kara and then at the saint cards now stained and smudged on a dozen chests. "I told them to stop making paperwork for the ecclesiarchy. They told me to stop being boring." "I'm flattered and terrified," Kara said, and the smile she managed was human-sized. Cashin reported in a clipped murmur to somebody whose voice only he could hear. He used the word secured like a sentence that could stand by itself. Lexham arrived in a click of legs and an avalanche of questions he had forgotten to translate into social, then stopped when he saw Vane's hand. "You sacrificed epidermal integrity to the device," he observed. Fascinated and almost tender. "Respect." Vane looked at his palm and made a face at the state of it, as if it were an untidy desk he would straighten later. He turned to Wren. The habit moving up his arm was as old as the Ordo's and he left it where it was. "Protocol says," he began, and then he let protocol finish the sentence in his head where it could not do harm. "We will write this day down," he said instead. "Accurately." "You can start with the part where you didn't shoot her," Logan said, blunt in the way only relief allows. "I will put it in the margin," Vane said dryly. They climbed past the market where oranges were now a memory and the boy with the wooden saint had found a ring of chalk to make into a game. He looked at Kara and hid the card and smiled like a conspiracy. They climbed past the engine chapel where Victor's tram waited with the calm of machines that have forgiven the last thing you did to them. They climbed into air that tasted less like metal and more like weather. The sky wasn't healed. It wore a scar thin as a hair where the wound had sulked. Light came through in banded gold, dirty at the edges from smoke, honest anyway. Sirens faded. Bells remembered to ring. People made noise that wasn't fear and so confused the pigeons, who landed and then left again because the air had too much opinion. On a rooftop that had watched them arrive, the 5 of them stopped because stopping has to happen somewhere. Keen left them with a nod that had more in it than any speech. Cashin saluted with the smallest angle of blade. Vane regarded the morning as if daring it to disappoint him and then allowed it to exist. Logan lay back and let the concrete leach heat from his shoulders. "So," he said, "breakfast, then interdimensional science." "I can build a rift sniffer out of choir parts and a toaster," Victor said. And it wasn't bragging because it sounded like a recipe. "I will find a star to borrow," Kara said and tilted her face to the light like a plant. Ren turned the locket in her fingers and didn't put it on. "The warp knows our names now," she said, almost apologetic, as if telling friends she'd let the wrong person in on a secret. "Good," Tim said, leaning his staff on his shoulder and watching the scar thin in the sun. "We won't let it forget who we are." Down in the square, someone started sweeping glass with the brisk fury of a person who had decided the day was theirs. A child laughed because someone dropped a pot and swore perfectly and then said sorry to the pot. The city, this tired, stained, stubborn city, remembered itself in 100 tiny gestures. They went downstairs to help it keep remembering.